Story number 1.
It was supposed to be a fun getaway. A group of friends, a secluded spot deep in the forest, and the promise of fresh air, campfires, and adventure. There was nothing out of the ordinary when we set out that Friday afternoon. The drive was long, but the excitement of escaping our busy lives kept us laughing and joking the entire way. It was me, Jake, Laura, Mark, and Sarah. The five of us had been friends since high school, and we were all used to camping together. But this time, we were heading deeper into the woods than usual. Much deeper. Mark had found the spot. He'd read about it on some online forum, a place so far off the beaten path that it was almost impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to go. He swore it would be perfect, quiet, peaceful, and untouched by the usual hordes of campers. I was a little skeptical, but I was always up for an adventure. By the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, leaving behind a stretch of twilight that cast everything in an eerie, golden light. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush. As we pulled off the narrow dirt road and onto an even narrower trail, the trees closed in around us, blocking out the last bits of sunlight. We parked and unpacked our gear, setting up our tents near a small clearing. The air smelled rich and earthy, fresh with the scent of pine. We didn't waste any time starting the campfire, and as the flames crackled and danced, we settled in, talking about everything and nothing. The night crept in quickly, and the forest around us began to darken, the trees stretching like shadows that seemed to move in the corner of our eyes. It wasn't until later that the unease began to settle in. At first, it was just a nagging feeling that we were being watched. Nothing overt, just a sense of something in the distance. I dismissed it as the usual paranoia that came with being out in the woods at night, but then I noticed that no animals were making any noise, no crickets, no owls, not even the wind in the branches. It was too quiet, too still. "Does anyone else think this place odd?" I asked, my voice low as I stared into the flames. Mark chuckled, trying to ease the tension. "It's just the forest, man. It's isolated, that's all. No one's been here in ages." But I wasn't so sure, and neither was Sarah. She was sitting beside me, but she kept glancing nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight. Her eyes darted back to me, wide with apprehension. "I don't like it here," she muttered. "I don't know why, but something feels wrong." Jake laughed it off, nudging her playfully. "You're just spooked. It's just the dark, nothing to be scared of." But the night wore on, and the tension only grew. Laura, usually the brave one, was quiet. Mark was no longer his usual boisterous self, and even Jake seemed on edge. We kept the fire burning hot, its warmth and light our only defense against the cold, oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond our small circle. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. The fire was still going strong, but we all retreated to our tents, the forest pressing in on all sides. My tent was closest to the edge of the clearing, and I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned, the sensation of being watched, never leaving me. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside the tent, branches creaking, footsteps in the leaves, something brushing against the fabric. I would sit up, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the deafening silence. Then around 2 a.m., I heard it, a low, guttural sound, coming from deep within the forest. It was distant at first, but unmistakable. A growl, like something large and heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening again. Nothing. I got out of bed and cautiously unzipped the tent flap, my breath catching in the cold night air. I peered into the darkness. There was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the silent forest stretching out endlessly in every direction. I stepped back inside and tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a deer or a bear passing by. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, the uneasy feeling still lingered, but we went on with the day, making breakfast and talking like nothing had happened. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and we decided to go for a hike to explore the area. We followed a narrow trail, our boots crunching on the dry leaves. As we walked, I noticed something strange. The trees here were different, thicker, older. Their trunks were twisted, their branches forming odd, unnatural shapes. But what bothered me more were the remnants of old structures, barely visible beneath the overgrown vegetation. An old stone foundation, the remnants of a crumbled chimney, rotting beams half buried in the dirt. "Anyone else see this?" Laura asked, stopping to examine the ruins. "Yeah, I see it," I said, a chill running down my spine. "Looks like an old house or something." We walked around the site, our footsteps muted by the soft earth beneath us. It didn't seem to fit. There was no record of anyone living out here, no sign of human habitation for miles. "We should keep moving," Mark said, clearly uncomfortable. "We're getting off the trail." We decided to continue on, but the forest felt different now. The air had grown thick again, as though something was watching us from the shadows. It was around mid-afternoon when the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it felt wrong, like words spoken just out of reach, faint and eerie. We all heard it, even Sarah, who had been mostly silent since we got here. She stopped in her tracks, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked in a voice that trembled. Jake nodded. "Yeah, it's just the wind. Let's keep moving." But Sarah wouldn't budge. She stood frozen, staring at something in the distance. Her eyes were wide, her breath shallow. "Sarah?" I called, stepping toward her. Suddenly, she gasped and stumbled backward. I saw something," she stammered. "Something standing in the trees. It was watching us." We all turned to look, but the trees were empty. There was nothing there, just shadows cast by the fading light. But the feeling that something was wrong intensified. "Let's go back to camp," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now." We made our way back, but the trail that had seemed so clear before was suddenly confusing. We couldn't remember which direction we had come from, and the woods around us felt like they were shifting, closing in. The trees seemed to lean toward us, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. When we finally stumbled back into the clearing, we found that our camp was in disarray. Our tents were torn open, the gear scattered across the ground. The fire pit was cold, the embers long dead. But the worst part, the most chilling part, was the strange, deep footprints in the dirt, leading away from the camp and into the woods. They were too large to belong to any animal we knew. We didn't stay long after that. We packed up quickly, barely speaking, and left the forest behind us. The entire drive back, we didn't say much. We were all too shaken, too unnerved by the feeling of being hunted, of something watching us. I don't know what happened out there, and I don't want to know. But I'll never forget the look on Sarah's face when she saw it, the thing in the trees. And I'll never set foot in that forest again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The sun had just dipped below the horizon as we set up camp deep in the woods. There were 4 of us: Alex, Sarah, Jake, and me, Leah. We'd been friends for years, always seeking out new places to explore, but this trip felt different. It was a camping spot far off the beaten path, the kind of place we had to hike hours to reach. The guidebook said it was a secluded, peaceful spot, and that's exactly what we were looking for. No one around for miles, just the forest, the stars, and us. The air felt crisp and fresh as we unloaded our gear, setting up tents in the small clearing by a creek. The soft rush of water trickling over rocks made the perfect background noise, soothing after the long trek. The trees towered over us, their shadows stretching long as the evening drew on. There were no other campsites nearby, no other signs of human life, just us and the vast, dense forest. We built a fire, sat around it, and cracked open a few beers, talking about old times and reminiscing about past adventures. It was all very familiar, until it wasn't. Around midnight, when the fire had burned low, we noticed a strange silence settling over the camp. The usual night sounds, the rustling of leaves, the calls of owls, the hum of insects, had all faded into an unnatural stillness. It wasn't just quiet, it was as if the entire forest had suddenly gone mute, holding its breath. Alex, the more adventurous one, stood up and stretched. "Anyone up for a walk? We can head up the creek a little bit." None of us were particularly eager to leave the warmth of the fire, but we reluctantly agreed. The air had grown chilly, and a thick fog was beginning to roll in from the forest. The creek was only a few hundred yards away, so we grabbed our flashlights and followed Alex down the narrow path that led toward it. At first, the walk was peaceful. The fog gave the trees an eerie glow, but everything seemed ordinary. We joked around, laughing as the mist curled around our ankles. But the further we walked, the quieter it became. The sound of the creek, which had been so present when we first arrived, was barely audible now, swallowed by the thick fog. We came to a small clearing near the creek, where the fog seemed to hang in the air like a curtain, swirling unnaturally in the stillness. Something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I glanced over at Sarah and Jake, who seemed to feel the same unease. They exchanged looks, their faces pale under the weak beam of the flashlights. "What's that?" Sarah whispered suddenly, pointing toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then my eyes focused, and I saw it. A shadow, standing motionless between two trees. It was a tall figure, but it wasn't human. It was as if the shape was made of darkness itself, like a stain on the night. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the fog, but it felt so real. Too real. "Is someone out there?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. We all stood frozen, staring at the figure. The fog thickened, wrapping around it like a cloak, obscuring it more with each passing second. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished, swallowed up by the mist. "We should go back," Alex said quietly, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Without another word, we turned and hurried back down the trail, our footsteps quick and urgent on the damp ground. When we reached the campsite, the fire had nearly gone out, but the feeling of dread hadn't left. We didn't speak much as we huddled around the dying embers, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest, which had seemed so serene when we arrived, now felt oppressive. The trees loomed over us, their branches stretching toward the sky like gnarled hands. We tried to laugh it off. "Probably just an animal," Alex said, "or our eyes playing tricks on us." But no one believed that. The way the figure had stood there, so still, so unnaturally still, didn't sit right with any of us. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. None of us slept well, tossing and turning in our tents, the sounds of the forest now seeming to press in on us. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept thinking about that shadow, what it was, what it wanted. The next morning, the fog had lifted and the forest seemed calm again, but the feeling of unease lingered. We packed up our things, eager to leave, but before we could head back, Alex suggested we take one last walk along the creek. I wasn't keen on the idea, but I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed. We walked in silence, the memory of the figure still hanging over us. The fog had cleared, but the woods felt heavier now, the trees crowding closer, the air colder. As we made our way down the creek, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps in the distance. I turned to the others, but they hadn't heard it. I strained my ears, trying to catch the sound again, but it was gone. Just as I was about to brush it off, I heard it again, a soft, rhythmic thumping, as though something was following us. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah stopped walking, her face pale. "What is it?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, "but we need to go." Without waiting for anyone to respond, I turned and started walking back to camp, faster now, my breath quickening. I could hear the others following behind me, but the footsteps, those slow, deliberate steps, sounded closer now, as if whatever it was right behind us. We reached the clearing near the campsite, and I dared to look over my shoulder. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, that something had been following us through the woods. When we got back to camp, we packed our things in a hurry. The forest, once beautiful and inviting, now felt like a prison. The trees felt like they were closing in on us, the air thick and suffocating. We didn't speak much as we hurriedly gathered our gear, our minds racing with thoughts of what we had seen and heard. By the time we reached the cars, we didn't even look back. We didn't stop until we were safely on the road, the forest behind us. The unease didn't leave us, though. It stayed with me long after we left, a heavy, lingering feeling that something had been out there with us, something that had followed us all the way back. To this day, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a trick of the light, if we were imagining things, or if something really was out there in the woods with us. But I know this. We didn't go back. And I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 3.
We were looking for something different, a break from the usual weekend getaways and overcrowded campsites. The deep forest was just what we needed. remote, quiet, and untouched by the bustle of city life. There were 5 of us: me, my brother Matt, and 3 of our close friends, Zoe, Harry, and Sam. We all had a love for adventure, and this camping trip felt like the perfect way to spend the long weekend. We drove to a place that had no name on any map, just a vague description in an old hiking guidebook Matt had found at a thrift store. It was located deep in the woods, far away from any marked trails or popular campsites, the kind of place where most people wouldn't dare go, and that's what made it even more appealing. No one else would be there. We arrived late in the afternoon with the sun dipping low behind the trees. The forest was dense, the shadows deep, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. We set up camp near a small clearing, far enough from the road so we couldn't hear any traffic, but close enough that we could find our way back easily. The campfire crackled as we gathered around it, roasting marshmallows and telling jokes. The sounds of the forest around us were faint, mostly the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Everything felt perfect, just like we imagined. But as night fell, the forest grew darker. The firelight flickered in the encroaching shadows, and an eerie quiet settled over us. We laughed less, spoke softer, and the sounds from the woods seemed to grow louder, closer. It wasn't anything we could explain, but something about the place didn't sit right. Matt, ever the brave one, suggested we take a short walk to explore the area before heading to bed. We grabbed our flashlights and headed off into the woods, trying to stay on the narrow trail we had used to reach our campsite. The air was cooler now, and the further we walked, the thicker the trees became, blocking out more of the fading light. The trail twisted and turned, winding through the dense underbrush. We joked about getting lost, but there was an uneasiness hanging over us that we couldn't shake. As we walked, the trees grew taller and closer together, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The forest felt alive, almost too alive. A rustle in the leaves off to the side made Zoe jump, and we all paused. But when we turned to look, there was nothing there, just the deep dark of the trees. We laughed it off, brushing it off as an animal or the wind, but none of us felt at ease. We pressed on, the path narrowing. Then, through the dense trees, we saw something, a structure, barely visible in the darkness. It was an old, dilapidated cabin, nearly swallowed up by the forest. The windows were dark and empty, the wooden planks of the walls rotting away. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. The air around it felt heavier, thicker. Sam was the first to speak, his voice low. "We should go back. This place feels wrong." We stood there, staring at the cabin. The fire in the distance seemed like a lifetime away, and the quiet of the woods seemed too still, too expectant. But curiosity got the better of us. We walked closer, the ground soft underfoot, the air thick with the scent of decay. The cabin had been built long ago, its wood splintered, its roof caving in on itself. There were no signs of life, no signs of anyone living there for decades. But when we shined our flashlights through the cracks, we saw something strange. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing the wall, a chair. But nothing else, no furniture, no personal items, just that one chair. "It's like someone just left," Harry said, his voice tinged with unease. We turned to leave, the weight of the place pressing on us, but as we did, I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, a coldness that seemed to sweep through the air, even colder than the night should have been. My breath fogged in front of me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Then the sound came. At first, it was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, a soft scraping like nails on wood, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from inside the cabin. None of us moved. We just stared, frozen in place, as the sound continued. Scrape, scrape, scrape. My heart pounded in my chest. It was as if something or someone was dragging that chair across the floor. Finally, Zoe spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go now." We turned and ran as fast as we could, not caring which direction we went. But the path that had seemed so familiar on the way in now felt like a maze. The trees closed in on us, the shadows growing deeper with every step. We tried to stay together, but the sense of being watched, being hunted, was overwhelming. The whispers came next. Low, almost imperceptible at first, but then they grew clearer. They weren't words exactly, but a series of unsettling sounds, like something trying to speak but not quite able to. It felt like the forest itself was speaking to us. And then as we ran, we heard something else, a low, guttural growl, deep and primal, echoing from the darkness behind us. Something was following us. Something was chasing us through the woods. We didn't dare look back. We ran faster, our breath ragged, our hearts pounding. The sound of the growl grew louder, closer. Whatever it was gaining on us. Finally, we burst through the trees and into the clearing where our camp was. The fire was still burning, but the warmth and safety we had felt earlier were gone. We were no longer alone. Matt grabbed the fire poker and stood in front of the rest of us. "Get to the car," he ordered, his voice steady, but his eyes wild with fear. "Now." We didn't hesitate. We scrambled to gather our things, but as we moved, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was alive. The trees seemed to bend toward us, their branches reaching out like fingers, blocking our way. The growl echoed again, and this time it was right behind us. We didn't look back, but we could hear it getting closer, feel the weight of it behind us. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the whispers became clearer, more frantic. They weren't just voices, they were cries, desperate and pleading. We reached the car, piled in, and slammed the doors shut. The engine roared to life, and we sped away, not daring to look back. The forest behind us faded into the night, but the weight of it stayed with us. The sounds, the whispers, the growl, they followed us, clinging to us like a dark shadow. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We found a motel and collapsed into our rooms, too shaken to speak. None of us could explain what had happened, what we had heard, what we had felt. But we all knew one thing for sure. The forest wasn't just a forest. It was something else, something old, something that had been waiting. And when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The whispers, the growl, the scraping of that chair. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape it. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind whispered through the towering pine trees as Jake, Emily, and Tom set up camp deep in Blackwood Forest. They had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the city's noise and immerse themselves in nature. The forest was dense. It's the kind that swallowed sunlight even in the afternoon. As the last light of day faded, they built a fire, its flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Jake, always the storyteller, leaned in and grinned. "You guys ever hear about the Blackwood disappearances?" he asked. Emily rolled her eyes. "Really? We're doing ghost stories already?" Tom, ever the skeptic, chuckled. "Go on, let's hear it." Jake cleared his throat. "Years ago, people went missing in this forest. Hikers, campers, entire families. No traces. Some say it's just nature, wild animals, or accidents, but others claim it's something else, something that lives in the woods, watching, waiting." The crackling fire was the only sound as he finished. Then Emily scoffed. "Classic horror cliché." Jake smirked, but Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Still, let's not wander too far from camp." That night, they retreated to their tents, the forest silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. But around midnight, Emily woke to an odd noise, a faint whisper. She sat up, heart pounding. The wind? No, it sounded like voices. She unzipped her tent and peeked out. The fire had burned low, but she saw something or someone standing at the tree line. A tall, shadowy figure, motionless. Emily gasped and blinked, but when she looked again, it was gone. She shook her head, convincing herself it was her imagination, and crawled back into her sleeping bag. In the morning, she hesitated before telling the others. "I swear I saw something last night. A person. Or something." Jake frowned. "A ranger, maybe?" Tom looked around. No footprints, and we're miles from any trails. Unease settled between them, but they brushed it off and went about their day, hiking deeper into the forest. Around noon, they came across an old campsite. The tents were torn, supplies scattered, no people. "This isn't right," Tom muttered. Emily knelt, picking up a rusted flashlight. "Who leaves their stuff like this?" Then they saw the carvings. Dozens of deep scratches on the trees surrounding the camp. Not words, but symbols, twisted, chaotic lines. And one thing stood out, a message. It watches, it follows, don't run. A cold shiver ran through them. Jake forced a laugh. Probably a prank, some wannabe horror film setup, but none of them believed that. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The fire burned bright, but the woods beyond it were pitch black. They sat in silence, every crack of a branch making them jump. Then, a whisper, low, indistinct, surrounding them. Tom shot up. Did you hear that? Emily clutched her flashlight. It's like last night. Jake's eyes darted around. Okay, very funny. If someone's out there, just come out. The whispering stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A figure emerged from the trees. It wasn't human. Tall, with impossibly long limbs, its face was obscured by darkness. It stood there, unmoving. Then it tilted its head. Emily screamed. Jake grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it toward the figure. It didn't flinch. Then it moved. One moment, it was standing there. The next, it was inches away from Tom. He stumbled back, but the thing didn't touch him. It leaned in. Close. Then a whisper. Directly in his ear. Don't run. Tom bolted. Tom, no! Emily cried, but he was already gone, disappearing into the blackness of the forest. Jake grabbed her arm. We have to find him. They ran after Tom, the forest closing in around them. But no matter how far they ran, there was no sign of him. Just trees. Endless trees. And then the whispering returned. They spun around. The figure stood between them and their camp. Its voice echoed in their minds. It watches. It follows. You shouldn't have come. Then it stepped back into the darkness. Emily and Jake barely made it through the night, huddled in their tent, knives clutched in their hands. Tom never returned. By morning, they fled. They ran until they found help, until they were safe. But Tom was never found. And sometimes late at night, when Emily and Jake close their eyes, they still hear it, a whisper in the wind. Don't run.
Story number 5.
The camping trip was supposed to be a fun escape, a break from work, from the city, from the noise of everyday life. There were 6 of us, friends who had been close since college. We'd camped together plenty of times before, but this time we wanted something different, something more remote. I can't quite recall why we chose the deep forest, miles away from any kind of civilization. Maybe it was the idea of being completely cut off, the allure of pure wilderness. Maybe we just wanted to get as far away from everything as possible. Tom, who had done the research, found a place that was tucked far into the woods, a secluded area only reachable by a narrow, winding dirt road. It was the kind of spot that didn't even show up on a lot of maps. Tom insisted it would be perfect. Quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. We packed our gear, loaded up the cars, and made the drive out early on a Friday morning. The journey wasn't too bad at first. The weather was pleasant, the sun shining brightly as we drove through scenic back roads. But as we got deeper into the woods, the landscape began to change. The trees thickened, growing taller and more densely packed. The air grew heavier, cooler. There was a strange stillness to it all, as though the forest had its own secret. Still, we kept driving, our spirits high, excited for the adventure that lay ahead. When we finally arrived, the place looked exactly as we'd hoped, untouched, beautiful, wild. A small clearing by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the babbling of water. We unloaded the cars, set up our tents, and began gathering firewood. We were all in high spirits, laughing, joking, reminiscing about old times. But as the afternoon sun dipped lower, I started to notice something odd. The forest around us, which had seemed so peaceful at first, now felt different. It wasn't the usual quiet of nature. It felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. The wind had died down entirely, and the usual chorus of birds and insects was absent. It was as if the entire forest was waiting for something. Does anyone else feel weird? I asked, trying to shrug off the growing unease. I was mostly joking, but the words came out with an edge I didn't expect. Tom, ever the optimist, waved it off. It's just the isolation, man. You're not used to being out here. That's all. But even he seemed distracted, his gaze darting to the edges of the clearing from time to time. The others were similarly quiet, their laughter subdued, as if they were also sensing the strange atmosphere. As the evening set in, we lit the campfire. The flames crackled and popped, throwing flickering shadows across the trees. We gathered around it, cooking dinner and continuing our conversation, but I noticed that no one seemed to want to stray too far from the fire. It felt as though the darkness outside the light was closing in on us. Still, we tried to keep things lighthearted, despite the undercurrent of unease. We stayed up late, telling stories and cracking jokes, but I could tell that everyone was ready for bed sooner than usual. When we finally retreated to our tents, I tried to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. There was no logical reason for it. The forest was peaceful, the night was calm, but something didn't sit right. I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. Then it happened. At first, it was just a sound, distant and muffled. A soft rustling like something was moving through the brush. I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then it came again, closer this time, more deliberate. I could feel my heart start to race as the sound seemed to move around our campsite, circling us. I wasn't the only one awake. I heard the shuffle of someone else moving inside their tent, then the quiet murmur of Tom's voice. "Did you hear that?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but yes, I'd heard it. The sound was growing more distinct, closer now, like footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. I could hear them in the soft earth, too soft to be human, yet too heavy to be an animal. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing for a moment. Then, a snap. A twig breaking, followed by more rustling, closer now, just outside the perimeter of our camp. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I unzipped the flap cautiously and peeked out, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The fire was barely aglow now, just embers, but I could make out the faint outlines of trees around us. The sounds were gone. The forest was still, too still. "Something's out there," I whispered to Tom, who had crawled out of his tent too. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "Maybe just an animal." But I could tell he didn't believe that either. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, until finally we heard a sound, a voice. Not from any of us, but from the woods. It was distant, faint, almost like a whisper, but I was sure it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a human voice, low and guttural. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill up my spine. I looked at Tom and I saw the same look on his face, confusion, fear. He was about to speak when the sound came again, this time closer. It was a whisper, but it wasn't a normal whisper. It felt wrong, like it was coming from somewhere deep. Not from the edge of the trees, but from within them. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, slow and measured, dragging through the leaves like as if something heavy was moving toward us. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, too close now. We froze, barely breathing, listening. I couldn't see anything, but the presence, the sensation of something standing just outside the fire's reach was undeniable. Then, suddenly, the whispering stopped, and in the dead silence that followed, we heard a sound, a growl. It wasn't an animal's growl. It was something deeper, darker, primal. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. Without a word, Tom grabbed my arm, and we ran, stumbling through the underbrush, the sound of our feet scrambling over the ground as we made our way toward the car. The others followed closely behind. No questions, no hesitation. We didn't look back. Not once. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a sound that was too horrible to describe. A shriek, a twisted, unearthly cry that didn't belong to anything on this earth. We reached the car, threw open the doors, and sped away. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I don't know what we left behind that night, but I know we didn't want to see it. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive home. When we finally got back to the city, we didn't even talk about it for days. We just tried to move on, but none of us went back to that forest. We never will. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The dirt road leading into the heart of Blackwood Forest was rough, barely wide enough for Ethan's truck. The headlights cast eerie shadows on the thick trees as he drove deeper, following the GPS coordinates his friend Matt had sent. "This place is in the middle of nowhere," Ethan muttered. Next to him, his girlfriend Chloe hugged herself. "That was the point, wasn't it?" Ethan glanced at her. "You're not scared, are you?" Chloe forced a chuckle. "No, just uneasy." They had planned this trip for months, a weekend of deep forest camping with their friends Matt and Rachel, away from cell service, away from everything. The kind of isolation that let you forget about the world. After what felt like forever, they finally spotted the flickering glow of a campfire through the trees. Ethan pulled up beside Matt's Jeep and killed the engine. The forest was suffocatingly quiet except for the crackling fire. Matt grinned as they climbed out. "Took you long enough." Rachel waved from her camping chair. "We were starting to think you got lost." "Almost did," Ethan admitted. They unpacked quickly, setting up their tent while Matt handed out beers. The night air was cold, and the darkness between the trees felt impenetrable. Rachel took a sip of her drink. You guys ever hear about the disappearances out here? Ethan groaned. Great, here we go. No, seriously, Rachel insisted. I read about it before we came. A couple of hikers went missing a few years ago. No bodies, no signs of an animal attack, just gone. People get lost in the woods all the time, Matt said. Rachel shook her head. This was different. No footprints leading away. Their campsite was untouched, as if they had just vanished into thin air. Ethan rolled his eyes. Sounds like a perfect campfire story. But Chloe wasn't laughing. Can we talk about something else? Rachel nodded. Sure. They changed the subject, but the unease never left. That night, after the fire had burned low, Ethan woke to a sound, a whisper. At first he thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice, faint, distant, calling his name. Ethan. He held his breath. The sound came from the woods beyond the fire's dying glow. He sat up, straining to hear. Ethan. It was closer now. He unzipped the tent carefully, peering out. The fire cast flickering light on the trees, but beyond that, only darkness. Then he saw it. A figure standing just at the tree line. Tall, motionless. Ethan's heart pounded. Matt? He whispered. No response. Then the figure moved, not walking, not stepping, sliding. It melted into the darkness between the trees, gone in an instant. Ethan's breath came fast and shallow. He considered waking Chloe, but didn't want to scare her. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe he had been dreaming. He lay back down, listening, but the whispering was gone. By morning, he had convinced himself it was nothing. Did anyone else hear something weird last night? Rachel asked over breakfast. Ethan stiffened. Like what? Rachel hesitated. Whispers. Chloe dropped her spoon. I heard them too. Matt frowned. Okay, what the hell? Ethan finally spoke. I saw something, a person, but it didn't move right. Rachel shivered. Maybe it was a ranger? Ethan shook his head. It wasn't human. Silence settled over them. The forest, despite the sunlight, felt darker. We should leave, Chloe said. Matt exhaled sharply. Come on, guys, we drove all the way out here. Ethan nodded slowly. Let's just be careful. That day, they hiked to a nearby ridge. The view was breathtaking, but the unease never left. They kept hearing things, branches snapping, distant murmurs. Then Rachel gasped. Guys, look at this. They turned to see what she was pointing at. Carved into a tree was a message. It watches. It waits. The bark was slashed as if by fingernails. A gust of wind blew through the trees, and suddenly the forest didn't feel empty anymore. That night, the whispers returned. Ethan barely slept, his mind replaying what he had seen. Then, right outside the tent, his body went rigid. Another step, closer. Then, breathing, low, rattling breaths. Chloe woke beside him, clutching his arm. Do you hear that? She whispered. He nodded. The breathing was right outside. Slowly, Ethan reached for his flashlight. Heart hammering, he flicked it on. Nothing. Then something whispered in his ear. Leave. He grabbed Chloe's hand and bolted out of the tent. Matt and Rachel were already outside, pale and shaking. Did you hear it? Rachel gasped. The breathing, Matt whispered. It was right behind me. Then from the trees came a sound that froze them in place. Laughter. Not human laughter. It was distorted, wrong, echoing from all directions. Then the figures emerged. Dark shapes standing in the trees, their eyes nothing but black voids. Rachel whimpered. Oh my God. Then they moved. Not walking, not running, gliding, straight for them. Go, Ethan shouted. They ran. Branches tore at them, the darkness closing in, the whispers turned into wails, the laughter growing louder. Then Chloe screamed. Ethan turned and saw something holding her. A hand stretching from the darkness, gripping her wrist. Matt lunged, yanking her free. The thing let out a guttural shriek. They ran until they burst into the clearing where the cars were parked. The figures stood at the tree line, watching, silent, motionless. Then they stepped back, fading into the trees, gone. Nobody spoke as they threw their gear into the cars. Ethan barely remembered driving, his hands trembling the entire way. Only once they were miles away did anyone say a word. Rachel, voice hollow, whispered, "We weren't supposed to be there." Nobody argued. A week later, Ethan woke to a sound outside his window. A whisper. He didn't look. He didn't sleep. And deep in the woods, the voices still called, waiting, watching. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The forest had always made Noah uneasy. Something about the way the trees stood too still, the way the wind barely rustled through the dense canopy, made him feel like he was being watched. But when his friends, Lucas, Sarah, and Danny, planned a weekend camping trip deep in Black Hollow Woods, he didn't want to be the only one to say no. The hike took most of the day, winding through overgrown trails and past abandoned cabins left to rot in the wilderness. They set up camp by a small clearing near a lake, the water black and still as glass. As night fell, they built a fire, cooking dinner and laughing, the unease of the hike fading into the warmth of the flames. "You guys know about the Black Hollow disappearances, right?" Lucas asked, grinning as he poked at the fire with a stick. Danny rolled his eyes. "Here we go." "I'm serious," Lucas continued. "This place? It used to be a logging camp, but back in the early 1900s, workers started vanishing. No bodies, no tracks, just gone. Eventually, the logging company pulled out, and people stopped coming here." Sarah shuddered. "And we're camping here. Why?" "Because it's just a story," Danny scoffed. "Probably made up to keep kids from wandering too far." But Noah wasn't so sure. There was something unnatural about the silence in the woods, as if the forest itself was listening. That night, long after the others had gone to sleep, Noah lay awake in his tent. The fire had burned low, and the woods were darker than he thought possible. Then he heard it, a whisper. At first he thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too human. A voice just outside his tent. Noah. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't even blink. He strained to listen, heart pounding. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Noah." He shot up, fumbling for his flashlight. Hands shaking, he unzipped the tent and shined the light outside. Nothing. The fire flickered weakly, illuminating the other tents. The trees stood still. The air felt thick, heavy. He forced himself to breathe, shaking his head. Just his imagination. Maybe the wind really did carry strange sounds out here. He crawled back into his sleeping bag, but sleep never came. The next morning, he hesitated before telling the others. "I swear I heard something last night. A voice." Lucas chuckled. "Ooh, the ghosts got you." "I'm serious," Noah insisted. "It knew my name." Sarah frowned. "Maybe you were dreaming?" Danny clapped a hand on Noah's shoulder. "If you're scared, we can head back." Noah shook his head. "I just think we should be careful." The unease didn't fade as the day went on. They hiked deeper into the woods, looking for a waterfall Lucas had read about. But as they walked, Noah started noticing something strange. The trees were changing. At first, he thought it was just his nerves, but soon the others saw it too. The bark of the trees was marked with deep scratches, as if something had clawed through them. More disturbingly, the scratches formed symbols, spirals, jagged lines, and something that almost looked like an eye. "This is messed up," Sarah whispered. "Probably just an old hiker's markings," Danny said, though he didn't sound convinced. But Noah felt it. Something was wrong. Then he saw it. A figure standing among the trees, far enough that its features were blurred, but close enough that there was no mistaking its presence. It was tall, too tall, its body wrapped in shadow. It didn't move, just watched. Noah's stomach turned to ice. "We need to go. Now." Lucas followed Noah's gaze and went pale. "Holy shit." Sarah let out a shaky breath. What is that?" Danny turned. But by the time he did, the figure was gone. They hiked back in near silence, the once bright morning now cold and lifeless. Even the birds had stopped chirping. That night, nobody joked around the fire. The forest loomed around them, black and endless. Then the whispers returned. Noah sat bolt upright in his tent. This time he wasn't alone. He heard Sarah gasp, heard Lucas curse under his breath. Something moved outside. Noah grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent just enough to peek out. The fire barely flickered, its embers casting weak light on the clearing. Then he saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the tree line. Their shapes were blurred, shifting in and out of the darkness, as if they weren't entirely solid. Their faces were pale, empty, watching. Lucas scrambled out of his tent. "We're leaving, now." Danny, still half asleep, groggily stepped out. Then he saw them. Jesus Christ. Sarah was already stuffing things into her pack, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip it. Then the figures moved. Slowly at first, their bodies barely making a sound against the forest floor. But as soon as Lucas grabbed his pack, they rushed forward. Noah didn't think, he just ran. Branches whipped against his face as he sprinted into the dark, his friends right behind him. The forest closed in, the path barely visible. Behind them, the whispers grew into a deafening roar. Noah glanced back and instantly regretted it. The figures weren't just following, they were gaining. Sarah screamed as something grabbed her ankle. Noah spun around, lunging for her arm. She kicked wildly, the thing's grip ice cold as it tried to drag her into the earth. Lucas and Danny grabbed her, yanking her free. They didn't stop running. Then the trees ended. They stumbled into the clearing, their car parked just beyond. They threw themselves inside, slamming the doors. For a moment, nothing moved. The forest was silent. Then Noah looked up. The figures stood at the tree line, no longer hiding, just watching. Danny fumbled with the keys, cursing as he started the engine. The headlights washed over the figures, and for the first time, Noah saw them clearly. They weren't just shadows. They were people. Or they had been. Their faces were hollow, their eyes nothing but black pits. Their mouths were open in soundless screams. Danny floored the gas. The car tore down the dirt road, the forest swallowing the figures behind them. They didn't stop driving until they reached town. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked back. The next day, Lucas searched online for any mention of Black Hollow Woods. What he found made Noah's stomach drop. A news article. Black Hollow Logging Camp, The Vanished Workers. It wasn't just a story. It was real. The loggers hadn't just disappeared. Their bodies had never been found. But their voices had been heard for years after. Hikers, campers, those who ventured too deep had reported whispers, figures standing just beyond the trees. Most never returned. Noah, Sarah, Lucas, and Danny never spoke about what happened that night. But sometimes when Noah closes his eyes, he still hears it. A whisper in the wind, calling his name. Noah. Story the end.